Hello, and thanks for tuning into this video. My name is Richard, and I run a company called Muddy York Walking Tours. I offer many different historical presentations and walking tours of Toronto. I put together this biography of Lucy Maud Montgomery as part of a series of talks I prepared on notable people who lived in Toronto. Most people associate Lucy Maud Montgomery with Prince Edward Island, but my reasons for including her here in a series on Toronto will become apparent. I made the presentation available here on YouTube so it can be viewed by a broader audience. My presentation addresses some issues surrounding mental health and depression, and I thought it was an important subject. I hope you enjoy the video that I prepared. Lucy Maud Montgomery was a Canadian author who published an incredible 20 novels, 530 short stories, 500 poems, and 30 essays. Her work made her famous within her own lifetime and gave her an international following. Lucy Maud Montgomery created the character of Anne Shirley, the character of Anne of Green Gables, back in 1908. Montgomery has been strongly associated with her best-known character ever since. Anne Shirley has taken on nearly real-life qualities, and it's true that Anne shares some semi-autobiographical life events with her creator, Lucy Maud Montgomery. But I would say that these days, Anne Shirley, the fictional character, overshadows the author who created her somewhat. And it was only when I started reading about the real life of Lucy Maud Montgomery that I realized how different her life was in comparison to the idyllic, animated, and irrepressible Anne of Green Gables. In reality, Lucy Maud Montgomery's life was quite a bit darker and more difficult than her most famous character, Anne of Green Gables. Montgomery faced a lot of emotional obstacles in her life, and I've tried my best to communicate these honestly without leaving anyone feeling depressed. And I'm going to try to end my presentation with some positive conclusions, so hang in there. One other point is to explain how I've decided to share a biography of Lucy Maud Montgomery as part of a series of talks on people who helped to shape Toronto. I realize, as I've said, that most people think of Prince Edward Island when they think of Lucy Maud Montgomery. But she spent the last 7 years of her life, from 1935 until 1942, living here in Toronto. I've shown her final home here at 210 Riverside Drive. It's located in the Swansea neighborhood in Toronto's West End, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Lucy Maud Montgomery was born on November the 30th, 1874. Even her infancy was marked by tragedy. Her mother, Clara, died of tuberculosis in 1876. Young Maud was only 21 months old. Her grief-stricken father, Hugh John Montgomery, placed Maud in the care of her maternal grandparents. He stayed in Prince Edward Island for a few more years, but when Lucy was 7, he moved west to what is now Saskatchewan. Lucy Maud Montgomery went to live with her maternal grandparents, Alexander and Lucy McNeil, here in Cavendish, Prince Edward Island. Her life in Cavendish was a lonely one, despite the fact that she had relatives living nearby. She created imaginary friends and playmates for herself, even going so far as to name them and developing personalities for them. But she often said that the imaginary world that she created helped her to develop her lifelong creativity. It's obvious that this part of her life influenced her later work. Her most famous character, Anne Shirley, was an orphan too. Anne's parents had died of typhoid fever when she was 3 months old. Anne was passed around from parents' housekeeper to another uncaring family and then to an orphanage. This itinerant life was even less stable than the one that Lucy Maud Montgomery knew. Lucy Maud Montgomery seemed sure of what her life would hold, even as a young girl. In 1887, when she was 13 years old, Maud wrote in her diary that she had early dreams of future fame. She submitted a poem for publication, writing of how I saw myself the wonder of my schoolmates, a little local celebrity. But she already seemed capable of such despondency, too. When her first poetry was rejected, she wrote, "Tears of disappointment would come, in spite of myself, as I crept away to hide the poor, crumpled manuscript in the depths of my trunk." These attacks of anxiety, of depression, would stay with Montgomery for her entire life. And yet there was hope and positivity too. She was also showing signs of resiliency despite her depression. She later wrote, "Down, deep down, under all the discouragement and rebuff, I knew I would arrive someday." Fortunately for the rest of us, Lucy Maud Montgomery's premonitions or intuition would come true. After completing her preliminary education in Cavendish, Lucy Maud Montgomery left Prince Edward Island for a year in 1890. This was when she traveled west to visit with her father, Hugh John Montgomery. When she went out to stay with her father, Prince Albert was a town of perhaps 1,000 people. Back then, Prince Albert was located in the Northwest Territories. The maps have changed, and these days it's situated in the province of Saskatchewan. Montgomery spent a year living with her father, who I've shown here. Her stay lasted from late 1890 until 1891. She was only 15 years old when she arrived out west. Her father had remarried to a woman named Mary Ann McCrae. Lucy Maud Montgomery didn't get along with her stepmother and wrote that her father's new marriage seemed like an unhappy one. But while Lucy Maud Montgomery was away in Prince Albert, she had her first poem published in a Charlottetown newspaper called the Daily Patriot. Her work echoed her deep love of nature, which would only grow through the rest of her life. This included both a love of gardening and a passion for wandering through the natural world. Over the course of her work, she often turned to nature for solace, and she often wrote about it. Maud's love of nature and connection to the outside world permeated so many of her fictional stories, as well as her journals and her personal letters. And fortunately, the success Maud found in publishing that first work while she was in Prince Albert encouraged Maud to continue writing. Lucy Maud Montgomery's year-long visit to Prince Albert ended in 1891. Her return home to Cavendish, Prince Edward Island, came as a relief. Her father, Hugh Montgomery, died a little less than a decade later on January the 16th, 1900, and he was buried in South Hill Cemetery in Prince Albert. But by that time, Lucy Maud Montgomery had discovered a blossoming success back in Prince Edward Island. Lucy Maud Montgomery moved to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island in 1893 when she was 19 years old. She was there to extend her education. But this is also when she started writing about a sensation she called the flash. She described this as a moment of tranquility and clarity, accompanied by a sense of emotional ecstasy. She said she felt inspired by her own awareness of a higher spiritual power running through nature, especially since she mostly experienced the flash during solitary walks through the peaceful island landscape. She gave this sensation, this flash, to several of her characters too. These included Anne Shirley, who Montgomery often had expressed an emotional or nearly spiritual communion with nature. There are several quotes by Anne Shirley that really express Lucy Maud Montgomery's heartfelt passion for nature. In Anne of Green Gables, Montgomery wrote, "One June evening, when the orchids were pink blossomed again, when the frogs were singing silvery sweet in the marshes about the head of the lake of shining waters, and the air was full of the savor of clover fields and balsamic fir woods, Anne was sitting by her gable window. She had been studying her lessons, but it had grown too dark to see the book, so she had fallen into a wide-eyed reverie, looking out past the boughs of the Snow Queen, once more bestarred with its tufts of blossom." In Anne's House of Dreams, published in 1917, Montgomery wrote, I love my garden, and I love working in it. To potter with green growing things, watching each day to see the dear new sprouts come up, is like talking or taking a hand in creation, I think. Just now, my garden is like faith, the substance of things hoped for. Or simply, in Anne of Green Gables again, Montgomery wrote, the world looks like something God has just imagined for his own pleasure, doesn't it? There were plenty of other quotations that I could have cited, but perhaps these are enough. They show us how Lucy Maud Montgomery took such a great comfort in nature. A deeply spiritual woman, Montgomery found the moments when she experienced the flash to be some of the most beautiful, moving, and intense moments in her life. In 1893, Lucy Maud Montgomery went to Charlottetown to obtain a teacher's license. When she was there, she fell in love with Prince Edward Island all over again. Though she didn't really enjoy teaching, it gave her time to write. Beginning in 1897, her short stories were published in several magazines and newspapers. She was a prolific writer and published over 100 stories in the 10 years between 1897 and 1907. During her teaching career all through the 1890s, Lucy Maud Montgomery drew the attention of several admirers. She had what were described as slim, good looks, and she won the attention of several young men. One of these suitors was a young man named Will Pritchard. Their friendship started out amiably enough, but eventually Will Pritchard developed stronger feelings for Lucy Maud Montgomery. Although she found Pritchard splendid and lots of fun, she wasn't physically attracted to him. Will Pritchard proposed marriage, but Maud declined, claiming that she only saw him as a friend. She wrote, I like Will better than any boy I'd ever met, but I know I didn't love him. Lucy Maud Montgomery and Will Pritchard did stay in touch for over 6 years, writing back and forth until he died of influenza in 1897 at the age of only 24 years old. But Montgomery immortalized Pritchard. It said that she used him as the basis for her character, Gilbert Blythe, in Anne of Green Gables. This was another example of art mirroring life in Lucy Maud Montgomery's work. The character of Gilbert Blythe fell in love with Anne Shirley, but it goes unrequited, at least at first. But after Gilbert Blythe nearly dies from typhoid fever and then completely recovers, he marries Anne Shirley. The two lived out a happy life together, at least in fantasy anyway. In February of 1897, Lucy Maud Montgomery was teaching at a school in Prince Edward Island when she received a love letter from a distant cousin named Edwin Simpson. It came as a complete surprise. They hadn't had anything to do with each other for 4 years, and she rarely thought of him. She wrote back to him that she might learn to care for him if he waited a while, but if he wanted an answer right then, her answer would have to be no. But all through the spring of 1897, Montgomery softened. She accepted his proposal in June of 1897, but she insisted they keep it a secret. She wouldn't even wear an engagement ring. One obstacle that Lucy Maud Montgomery and Edward Simpson faced was the fact that they were actually second cousins. Montgomery's maternal grandparents, Alexander McNeill and Lucy Woolner McNeill, were vociferously opposed to any marriage between cousins. And besides, the McNeills had always hated the Simpson branch of the family. Lucy Maud Montgomery soon realized she had made a terrible mistake. At first, she thought that if she loved Edwin Simpson enough, she could ignore his faults and imperfections. But she was wrong. He was intolerably self centered and vain, to the point that she felt nauseated in his presence. Later, she would write, he kept talking until I felt tired of the sound of his voice. When we reached home, he came in. As for me, I was suddenly in the clutches of an icy horror. I shrank from his embrace and kiss. My God, what have I done? The engagement that started in June of 1897 lasted until March of 1898. That's when Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote to Edwin Simpson and broke it off. He didn't take it well. He pleaded with her, but she didn't even want them to remain friends. She told him, in a sense of harsh clarity, that everything was finished. The engagement was definitely over. In October of 1897, while she was still engaged to Edwin Simpson, Maud moved to Bedeck in Prince Edward Island. She taught in the schoolhouse, which is now an historic site. She was a month away from her 23rd birthday. Maud boarded with a local family called the Lairds. The Laird homestead is still standing too, and these days it's still privately owned by local residents. But 3 weeks after Montgomery moved in, back in 1897, she was coming home from a Saturday night church social with one of the family's sons, named Herman Laird. Lucy Maud Montgomery would later recount what Herman Laird did on the carriage ride home. She wrote, "Suddenly, Herman leaned over, passed his arm about me with a subtly caressing movement, and drew my head down on his shoulder." Things certainly escalated from there over the weeks to come. When the couple first kissed, Montgomery described how I seemed swayed by a power utterly beyond my control. Our lips met in one long, passionate pressure. She regretted it, of course, and she wrote, "This must not go on." But it did. Montgomery often invited Herman Laird up to her bedroom when everyone else was out. Although she refused to have sex with him, they certainly kissed one another and engaged in what she called preliminary lovemaking. Montgomery described Laird in her diary as a very nice, attractive young animal who had magnetic blue eyes. There is absolutely nothing to suggest that the couple engaged in premarital intercourse. Quite the contrary. Lucy Maud Montgomery grew up in Victorian era Canada at a time when all young people, or at least young women, were taught the virtues of chastity. Lucy Maud Montgomery's strict Presbyterian upbringing taught that young ladies were supposed to be pure and virtuous. It taught that anyone who fornicated was among the eternally damned. Maud had taken these lessons to heart, but with Herman Laird, she was definitely tempted. There were definitely obstacles to any relationship between Montgomery and Laird. For starters, as I mentioned, Montgomery was still engaged to Edwin Simpson. She might have been unhappy with Simpson, but she wrote about preserving her self respect and staying faithful to him. But Herman Laird was also engaged to a neighbor named Etty Sherman. This is a picture of Etty with some of her school friends. Etty is seated at the very far left of the photograph. As attractive as Herman Laird might have found her, that didn't keep him from having a clandestine relationship with Lucy Maud Montgomery. All the things came to a head in the spring of 1898. Montgomery's grandfather, Alexander McNeil, died suddenly on March the 5th, 1898, at the age of 77 years old. Montgomery moved back to Cavendish to take care of her now widowed grandmother. She stayed in Cavendish until her grandmother died on March the 10th, 1911, aged 86 years old. There would never be any chance of reunion between Lucy Maud Montgomery and Herman Laird. Herman Laird died of influenza on June 30th, 1899. He was 28 years old. Something in Montgomery's search for romance died with him, and it's true that she mourned him for the rest of her life. The things Maud wrote in her diary were bleak, dark, and morose. It's easier to think him as dead, mine, all mine in death, as he could never be in life. Mine when no other woman could ever lie on his heart or kiss his lips. I found this part of the real life Lucy Maud Montgomery's life story to be a contrast to the life story that her most popular character, Anne Shirley, led. For Anne Shirley, the character, there may have been playfulness and even flirtation, but her love life always seemed to have a sense of naivety and innocence. By contrast, Lucy Maud Montgomery's real life love stories seem to be filled with physical passion, but also terrible indecision, dissatisfaction, and even bitter disappointment. From the time that she moved back to Cavendish in 1898, Lucy Maud Montgomery was mostly able to support herself through her writing. She was in her mid 20s. Over the next decade, she wrote articles for newspapers and other periodicals and published her first books during these years. These included, of course, Anne of Green Gables in 1908. When Lucy Maud Montgomery published Anne of Green Gables in 1908, it changed the whole course of her calling as an author. It was her first book and her most popular. This really established her writing career. Anne of Green Gables was extraordinarily popular. It was first published in June of 1908. A year and a half later, by November of 1909, it had gone through 6 different printings. Montgomery wrote and published material, including sequels to Anne of Green Gables, for the rest of her life. The Canadian press made much of Montgomery's roots on Prince Edward Island. This setting was portrayed as a charming and even romanticized part of Canada, where the people retained old fashioned values and everything moved at a slower pace. This was in contrast to urban centers like Toronto, where life seemed built up, overcrowded, industrialized, fast paced, and stressful. At least part of the reason why Anne of Green Gables was so successful was because it allowed a lot of readers to escape from the growing pressures of their day to day lives. But this marketing scheme backfired a little bit, at least in international markets. The American press suggested that all of Canada was backwards and slow. Several American reviewers argued that a book like Anne of Green Gables was only possible in a rustic country like Canada, where the people were nowhere near as advanced as down in the United States. Several American reviews portrayed Lucy Maud Montgomery as a modest young schoolteacher. This is misleading. For starters, Maud was 34 years old when she published Anne of Green Gables. Now, that's certainly not old, but she wasn't the nearly adolescent author that some reviewers made her out to be. Some of the vaguely condescending reviews that Lucy Maud Montgomery received were no doubt attempts made by literary critics to portray Montgomery as a sort of female author who was idealized in her day. More and more women were becoming authors and journalists and breaking into what was still mostly a male profession. Critics emphasized Montgomery's gender by portraying her as someone who was happiest in a domestic or rural environment and who was disinterested in the fame and celebrity that many people felt conflicted with femininity at the time. It was okay for Lucy Maud Montgomery to write books, even though she was a woman, as long as she didn't want to be a full time professional author and she kept on being an unspoiled woman. On July the 5th, 1911, Lucy Maud Montgomery married a clergyman named Reverend Ewan MacDonald. He was a Presbyterian minister. The couple moved to Ontario, where MacDonald had taken the position of minister at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. This was located in Leasdale in present day Uxbridge Township. Montgomery wrote her next 11 books from the Leasdale Manse, which I've shown here. She was extremely productive, despite her observations that the house had neither bathroom nor toilet. Ewan MacDonald was not especially intelligent, nor was he interested in literature. Montgomery wrote in her diary of how I would not want him for a lover, but I hope at first that I might find a friend in him. Lucy Maud Montgomery and Ewan MacDonald took their honeymoon in England and Scotland. The latter was a particular point of interest to Maud, as it was the old country, the romantic land of castles, rugged mountains, shining glens and lakes, and her ancestral homeland. By contrast, Ewan MacDonald had little interest in visiting Scotland whatsoever. Maud practically had to drag him to visit the Isle of Skye, the home of Clan MacDonald. Montgomery was certainly more aware of and more interested in her Scottish heritage than her husband was. Furthermore, Maud had read the works of Scottish writers like Robbie Burns or Sir Walter Scott, but her husband did not read literature at all, forcing his wife to explain to him who Burns and Scott even were. This disparity in their interests was like a harbinger of what was to come. The couple had three children, three sons named Chester, Hugh, and Stuart, although the middle son, Hugh, was stillborn. Montgomery believed that it was her duty as a woman to suffer through whatever hardships married life threw at her and to try to make the marriage work. Once she settled into married life and the manse in Leasdale, Montgomery dedicated herself into her work, writing more and more in order to escape the more unpleasant hardships of her own real life. In 1911, she published a novel called The Story Girl. The book's main protagonist was a 14-year-old storyteller named Sarah Stanley. Sarah Stanley was clearly an idealized adolescent version of Lucy Maud Montgomery. And in the novel, Sarah Stanley chooses a romantic relationship with another character named Peter Craig, whose physical looks and personality were clearly based on Herman Laird, the young man who Lucy Maud Montgomery had passionately loved and lost. Lucy Maud Montgomery was a fervent supporter of the Canadian war effort. She saw the First World War as nothing short of a crusade to save civilization. She regularly penned articles urging men to volunteer for the army and for people at home to buy victory bonds to help fund the war effort. In Leasdale, like everywhere else across Canada, church ministers and their wives organized recruiting meetings. The Reverend MacDonald would speak out against the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, describing him as the personification of evil and describing his actions in graphic detail. Lucy Maud Montgomery joined her husband in appealing for volunteers who could step up and fight for Canada, for the British Empire, and for justice in what she described as a crusade against wickedness. Montgomery argued that before the war, Canada had been slipping into atheism, materialism, and moral decay. She felt the war had brought about a welcome revival of Christianity, patriotism, and moral strength, all thanks to the challenges that Canadians faced during the greatest war that was yet fought in human history. But Lucy Maud Montgomery also noted that women on the home front were playing a crucial role in the war effort. Many women were leaving behind domestic life for the first time and going out to work in munitions plants and factories. This led Montgomery to join the cause for women's suffrage and getting women the right to vote. Lucy Maud Montgomery celebrated every Allied victory during the war, hoisting up flags when one of the Allied nations won any sort of battle. By contrast, every Allied defeat brought on great bouts of depression. Eventually, the war became just about everything Lucy Maud Montgomery thought about and all that she wanted to talk about. She was absolutely consumed by the war, obsessed over it, racked by it, and tortured by it, even addicted to it. She would get annoyed at her husband if he did not buy a newspaper out on the street corner so that she could read that day's latest war news. Meanwhile, her husband started developing doubts about the justice of the war. He started to believe that he had sinned egregiously by encouraging so many young men to enlist. Montgomery wrote about her husband's change in attitude. She said, "It unsettles him, and he cannot do his work properly." He eventually refused to even preach about the war. This perspective disgusted Lucy Maud Montgomery and put a severe strain on their marriage. The first of the armistices that ended the First World War came into effect on November the 11th, 1918. People here in Toronto, across Canada, and all over the world celebrated the return of peace. But for Lucy Maud Montgomery and her husband Ewan MacDonald, the war had brought about irreparable relational damage. Lucy Maud Montgomery suffered through several periods of depression while she was trying to cope with the duties of motherhood and with church life and with her husband's own attacks of religious melancholia, psychological depression, and declining health. Montgomery also contracted the Spanish flu near the end of 1918. In early December 1918, she wrote in her diary, "I was in bed for 10 days. I never felt so sick or weak in my life." She expressed thanks to God and her friends for helping her to survive the ordeal. But she was so angry at her husband's indifference to her suffering that she considered filing for a divorce. This would have been extremely difficult for a woman to do in Canada at the time. And anyway, Montgomery eventually decided that it was her Christian duty to try and make the marriage work. Reverend Ewan MacDonald's religious beliefs eventually grew into a mania that put a terrible strain on the couple's marriage. He believed in the theology of predestination, a concept that God would only allow the elect into paradise. And he believed that neither he nor his wife Maud nor their children were part of the elect. He often said that he wished none of them had ever been born because they were destined to spend eternity with the damned. This is a photograph of Ewan and Lucy flanked by their two surviving sons, Stuart and Chester. The photo was taken about 1924. By that point, Ewan MacDonald was spending hours depressed and staring off into space. He refused to help Maud with raising the children or doing the housework, and even showed signs of suicidal behavior. Lucy Maud Montgomery was driven to depression herself, thanks to her husband's conduct. She often wrote that she wished she had married somebody else. She wrote in her diary that sometimes she couldn't even stand to look at her husband, especially when he got a blank, imbecilic expression on his face. In 1925, Ewan MacDonald and Lucy Maud Montgomery had to leave St. Paul's Presbyterian Church and the manse in Leasdale. Reverend MacDonald became estranged from his flock because he opposed the union of some Presbyterians, Methodists, and Congregationalists into the new United Church of Canada. Leaving their home in Leasdale made for a bitter departure. The congregation had liked Reverend MacDonald, but they had loved Lucy Maud Montgomery. In 1934, Ewan MacDonald checked himself into a sanatorium in Quebec, in Guelph. He went on medication, he became paranoid, and his mental health started to deteriorate. Although the couple were able to keep up a respectable married appearance in public, Ewan MacDonald disappeared from ministerial life. In 1933, Montgomery published a book called Pat of Silver Bush. This reflected a move towards more adult stories for young people. The main character, Patricia Gardner, was another extension of Lucy Maud Montgomery's character. Whereas Anne Shirley, Anne of Green Gables, is a vibrant character with a sense of optimism, Pat Gardner is a moody girl and a loner. Both characters had some of Montgomery's own personality traits, but it was Pat Gardner who Montgomery described as being more like herself than any of her other characters. And yet, Pat Gardner still had a deep attachment to the family farm called Silverbush out of the countryside of Prince Edward Island. This mirrored Lucy Maud Montgomery's own attachment to the rural farm life that she grew up on. In 1935, Lucy Maud Montgomery and her husband Ewan MacDonald moved to the Swansea neighborhood of Toronto. They bought a house at 210 Riverside Drive, not far from the eastern shores of the Humber River. They called their home Journey's End, and it's still standing today. Montgomery kept battling depression, taking medication to help improve her moods, but she also kept writing to keep up her spirits. She published Anne of Windy Poplars in 1936 and Anne of Ingleside in 1939. These marked her return to writing about Anne Shirley after a 15-year hiatus. But she also wrote other work. Jane of Lantern Hill was a non-Anne book that was published in 1937. The book's main protagonist, Jane Stewart, navigates an acrimonious relationship between her mother and her grandmother, discovers that she has an estranged and absent father, and befriends another girl who is an orphan. But so many of Lucy Maud Montgomery's works repeatedly involve family issues or orphans or children who were either abandoned by or separated from their parents. Her works often included either children who were raised by uncaring relatives or by childless mothers or spinsters. From her very first novel, Anne of Green Gables, through it all till her later works like Magic for Marigold or Jane of Lantern Hill, Maud wrote about the complexities of family life while expressing how childcare was such a crucial role for women. She was clearly projecting her own experiences as well as her own thoughts and beliefs into her work. On April the 24th, 1942, Lucy Maud Montgomery was found dead in her home at 210 Riverside Drive in Toronto's Swansea neighborhood. She was 67 years old. Her body was taken back to Prince Edward Island, where she was given a funeral in the Cavendish United Church and then buried in Cavendish Community Cemetery. Lucy Maud Montgomery's official cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis, that is, a blood clot that formed in a blood vessel in her heart. But in 2008, one of her granddaughters, Kate MacDonald Butler, spoke out about her grandmother and how she had suffered from depression. Kate Butler speculated that her grandmother may have ended her life through an intentional drug overdose. The basis of this was, in part, a note that was found on Lucy Maud Montgomery's bedside table. It read in part, "I have lost my mind by spells, and I do not dare think what I may do in those spells. May God forgive me, and I hope everyone else will forgive me, even if they cannot understand. My position is too awful to endure, and nobody realizes it. What an end to a life in which I tried always to do my best." In 2008, an author named Mary Rubio wrote a biography about Lucy Maud Montgomery, in which she offered an alternative explanation. She suggested that the note may have been intended as an entry in part of a journal that is now otherwise lost, instead of as a suicide note. It's true that by 1920, Lucy Maud Montgomery was editing and recopying her journals, presenting her life as she wanted it to be remembered. In doing so, she changed or omitted parts of her life story that she did not want to have left behind. It's certainly true that I was tempted to edit or tone down Lucy Maud Montgomery's life story for my presentation, and perhaps I have to some extent. My goal today has not been to depress anybody, although I know that today's presentation has taken on a heavier tone. We can ask ourselves why we should tarnish the memory of such a well loved author as Lucy Maud Montgomery by discussing whatever struggles she might have had. Some people might maintain that it's best to remember her strictly in the most positive light, as an extremely popular, best selling literary figure. But Lucy Maud Montgomery's granddaughter, Kate MacDonald Butler, explained this better than I ever could. She wrote an article in the Globe newspaper in 2008 that said, in part, I have come to feel very strongly that the stigma surrounding mental illness will forever be upon us as a society until we sweep away the misconception that depression happens to other people, not us, and most certainly not to our heroes and our icons. I'd only add that depression is not a sign of weakness or failure, far from it. It even tormented one of the most celebrated Canadian authors of all time. It's crucial that we remove any stigma around depression. It's absolutely essential to talk about it and to try to find help and treatment for it. But I also think that we can find redemption and salvation in Lucy Maud Montgomery's story. She's left behind such a great body of work that's brought immeasurable joy to millions of people over the past century and more. Even today, her work is still drawing attention, study, and praise. In 2014, the CBC conducted a poll that saw readers vote Anne Shirley as Canada's most iconic fictional character. The biographer that I mentioned, Mary Rubio, has studied the life of Lucy Maud Montgomery for years. She acknowledged Montgomery's severe depression, but also said that Anne of Green Gables was Canada's most enduring literary export. The BBC conducted a survey in 2003 that ranked Anne of Green Gables ahead of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, George Orwell's Animal Farm, and Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And thousands of tourists visit Prince Edward Island every year to pay tribute to the sacred sites relating to Anne of Green Gables, its colorful landscape, and its venerated author. Lucy Maud Montgomery's home in Leasdale, Ontario, and in the Green Gables area around her home in Cavendish, Prince Edward Island, were both made National Historic Sites in 1997 and in 2004, respectively. And in 1983, the City of Toronto named a park in Montgomery's honor. Lucy Maud Montgomery Park is located on Riverside Drive in the village of Swansea, not far from the home that she died in. I know that people will mostly always associate Lucy Maud Montgomery with Prince Edward Island, but standing in West End Toronto, looking at that small park named in Maud's honor, I can't help but reflect on her life story. It's certainly true that she battled some bleak times, but ultimately I feel as though I want to acknowledge the dark things that she went through while celebrating all of her accomplishments. She lived through her pain, but she provided so much joy and contentment for so many people. Maybe this is her greatest accomplishment. Pain can be far too easy to dwell on, but whether she eventually overcame it or not, she's most and best remembered today for all the happiness that she brought to so many countless people. I'm going to conclude with a short heritage minute about Lucy Maud Montgomery. But first, I have one final quote from one of Lucy Maud Montgomery's books, Anne's House of Dreams, that was published in 1917. She wrote, "We miss so much out of life if we don't love. The more we love, the richer life is."
What do I like? I like open fires, moonlit nights, chatty letters, rainy days. I like daydreaming. I love this colorful little island of ruby, emerald, and sapphire. Yet often my dark moods come. I'm possessed body and soul by this depression. They say women shouldn't write. Some days I almost give up. But I cannot contain my imagination. I made Anne real. I gave her my love of nature, my love of books, and my childhood dreams. My greatest happiness would be to climb the alpine path and write upon it a woman's humble name.
Lucy Maud Montgomery battled depression, rejection, and sexism to become known around the world for Anne of Green Gables and 19 other novels.
This concludes my presentation. Thanks again for watching. I posted a link in the video description below that will take you to the Heritage Minute video about Lucy Maud Montgomery here on YouTube. Just a reminder to please comment on my video here with any comments, questions, or observations. You can also email me at richard@muddyyorktours.com or contact me over social media. There are also links in the video description below that will take you to my website, my Facebook group, and my Instagram account, which has hundreds of photographs of Toronto's history. Thanks again for watching.